Hello everybody, Lance here, and this is the final video for the Blender 2.8 sculpting series. And in this video we will sculpt the apple into some sort of monster. But before we begin, let's just add some material and render the pumpkin as well as the apple. Alright, so that is the light setup for the scene. Now it's time to make the material for the objects. The materials for these objects are going to be rather simple. There is nothing special about them, just simple glossy colors, and that's it. Now that the materials for the fruit are done, let's move on to make the monster. So select the apple as well as the stem and then duplicate it and move it aside. And then we select the original apple and hit Ctrl I to invert the selection and then hit H to hide everything. Switch to the Sculpting UI and then turn on the dynamic topology and then set the details to 6 pixels, and let's start sculpting. For this particular project there will be no right or wrong because this monster does not exist in real life, so nobody can tell us that we sculpted wrong, you know. So just forget all about the technical side of thing and forget all about the right and wrong and just sculpt however we like. The only limitation is your own imagination, so let's get creative. This entire video is gonna be sped up because there is no new technique in this particular video, and the only thing different here is imagination. Here you can see me blocking out the places where I want the features to be. I want to make it look like a dead monster, something that is undead and decaying. So I'm just sculpting some random details around. It must look like it has some sort of internal cancer, some sort of tumors that are growing from within. Now that we have the bigger blocks, let's go ahead and make the smaller details. As you can see, the brush that I use the most is the clay strip brush, and I use it to quickly block out the big features as well as sculpting the small details. The crease brush is also very useful. Alright, so this part down here looks like the head of a worm. So I end up decided to try to sculpt a worm out of this area. However, when it comes to sculpting different objects, it is advisable to just separate the worm into a different object and then sculpt it later. Similar to the stem of the pumpkin, sculpting everything in one mesh like this will bring quite a lot of trouble. As you can see later on in this video, I will get into quite a little bit of trouble with the worm. But for the time being, I'm just messing around with the shapes. Alright, now it is time to make the other section of the worm. So I switched back to the default UI and make the body of the worm using cylinder. And here it's all about extruding the cylinder to connect the two holes that I dig. Now this is not the best way to model the body of the worm, but for the sake of this video I don't use any advanced technique. In the future we will learn a different feature of Blender to model long and curved objects like this much more efficiently. But for the time being, let's just use the basic technique. Okay, so the basic shape of the worm is pretty much done. Originally I tried to just sculpt on top of the base mesh of the worm, but I figured that I should probably divide the worm before sculpting. So now that I have a lot more geometry to work on, I go back to the sculpt mode and turn on the dynamic topology and then start sculpting. Now the body of the worm consists of very repetitive sculpting, so I'm going to speed up the video even more for this particular section. Alright, the body of the worm is complete, and as you can see, by separating the worm into a different object, it is much easier to sculpt everything. Now let's move on to the teeth of the monster. So I started by creating a cone and then position it where I want the teeth to be. And like the rest of the model, we will use the dynamic topology to sculpt the teeth. Now since this is a random monster, I don't want it to be very symmetry, so I ended up placing the teeth rather randomly. Nobody can tell us where the teeth should be, so just place wherever we like. Alright, let's move on to the tongue of the monster. For the tongue, I start with the box and then extrude the box out like so, and then place the vertices rather randomly so that we have a random looking tongue. Alright, now that the monster is done, let's go ahead and make some material for it. Alright, so let's make some material for the worm, and for this particular worm I'm going to crank up the subsurface value a little bit so that some light actually scatters through the body of the worm. Now let's move on to the color of the apple. Originally I want to make the apple green, but green is not a creative color, so I decided to reverse back to red, with a little bit of deadness to it. And for the tongue, let's make it a little bit dark red, like so. And the tongue is wet, so it's going to be glossier than the skin. Now at some point in this video I actually moved the apple a little bit. That is why we see that the teeth are floating in mid-air. So here I'm trying to fix the teeth by first select the entire thing and then deselect everything that is not teeth, and then move the teeth up where they belong. Now that the teeth are all in place, I return to the materials. So here I try to give the monster a vile green, but green is not a creative color, so later in this video you see me change the color back to red. So here is the problem with the worm. I try to give it a different material, but because everything is in a single mesh, it's going to be very hard to separate the worm and give it a different material. So here you can see that I'm trying various different techniques to assign a different material for the worm, but this is a failed attempt, so pay no attention to this technique. I will explain to you about this painting mode later on. So right now I am trying to select all the vertices that belong to the worm. As you can see, that is a very time-consuming process, and that is why you should separate the worm into a different object in the first place. So here I add one more material and assign the worm skin to this material. Now here I'm just playing around with the nodes to try to improve the material of the worm. There is no real thought process for this part, and again for this particular part there is no right or wrong, just me improvising stuff all the way. So by the end of the project I realized that the monster is disgusting and it looks gross, and I wanna puke. So let's all agree to never be creative again.